Hello, my name is Ryan Wicks. I'm a UAS pilot, data analyst, and equipment technician. Um, and like many of you, I've been learning to live and adapt to living in a pandemic. Um, and so part of that for me has been to try to find resources to understand the raw data that's out there in terms of case numbers by region, looking at some peer-reviewed papers, doctor commentaries, and opinions, um, and just knowing where I can get the data so I can find out, techniques and ways to protect myself as well as protecting others. So looking at recommended guidelines for personal behavior, but also trying to understand the, you know, COVID-19 in terms of an epidemiological sense and a modeling sense. And so I've been doing my own analysis. I've been looking at the analysis that others have done. This helps orient me, and maybe it's a coping mechanism for myself to try to understand the, um, you know, something I'm dealing with, like many other people, just being able to understand and feel oriented to what's going on and why certain policies are being implemented and what certain protocols are effective and techniques are effective in safeguarding myself and others. Um, and and part of it's also probably some fascination. And I, did some modeling to try to develop tools for assessing risk for an individual as well as for communities. And this is just some analysis that I wanted to share with others, because I found in conversations that not everyone's aware of the same resources and where to find the raw data for case numbers, where to find analyses that have been done. As well, not just for COVID-19, but in terms of epidemiology and mathematical models in general that are used for modeling pandemics, epidemics, and diseases, and how they affect a society and how the cases are projected and forecast to spread and how those models work. But also the raw data sources and the different resources for understanding what caseloads are in different regions for planning your own personal endeavors and whatever you're trying to do in your life as you try to make do living in a pandemic. So I want to be able to share those resources as well. And I found that not everyone knows those. So I wanted to put together this presentation to, one, talk about those models, epidemiological models, and specifically COVID-19. But also number two is to talk about how the science behind our understanding of pandemics in general and COVID-19 has influenced policies and what the targeted outcomes of those are, and how the recommended shifts in behavior and guidelines help protect people, and how science actually informs those decisions. It's not just arbitrary, and why certain procedures are effective and why some are more effective than others. So I wanted to be able to talk about that as well. So talk about it, and then I also wanted to be able to share the resources that I found to give guidance to where to find the raw data, where to find the literature that's objective and gives a high level view about what's going on, as objective as you can be, and is scientifically grounded, as well as where the resources are to be able to get support if you do contract COVID-19 or have individuals that you're trying to support that have contracted it. So I wanted to be able to share this since I put this presentation together, so I can share my analysis and the resources that I found to be quite helpful for me. My background is in applied physics and sustainability science, and so while epidemiology is not my profession, I have done population modeling, and I've worked with other analytical models in the academic work that I've done, as well as the professional work that I've done. And so certainly that background has given me at least a stepping stone to look into the literature on epidemiology, and specifically COVID-19 in context of epidemiological models. And so I wanted to be able to share what I found, and hope the expectation that might be helpful to some people, certainly some part of it. So there's a lot to cover in this presentation that I'm calling Thinking Critically About COVID-19 Insights from Basic Models. And so I want to break this down into several parts. There's 3 parts. One is just talking about epidemiology, general models, and how those models can be applied to COVID-19. The impacts on public health policies and why they work. So how the science informs the policies and the different recommended, social behaviors that are recommended for individuals to adapt to systemically be able to curb the spread of an infection like COVID-19, as well as simple steps and tools to adapt. So those resources that are available in guidelines, and being able to share those and where to find those, and be able to where to access the expert advice beyond the amateur analysis that I've done. And I may do a fourth video, so I'm going to try to keep this objective and concise and talk about the science and the policies, and be able to give information to folks. But I also have my own opinions about how to take the information that I'm presenting here and be able to talk about my own perspective on how to analyze that. For now, I'm just trying to keep it more or less objective, and at least be able to show the framework for how to deal with risk and risk analysis, and the modeling, and how to public health officials might deal with a pandemic, and give some insight into that. And there are plenty of other presentations that I've cited and resources out there that give a much more detailed look from the experts themselves. But I've also done my own analysis, which is a little unique beyond what I've seen others do. And so I wanted to share that, and I'm presenting on it, but I'm also I have links to those tools that I've developed in Google Sheets and whatnot, so that people can play around with the numbers themselves and become more familiar with the models. I'll probably break this down into several videos, just so it's easier for, so folks can jump to the parts they want. The first one is more about the theoretical background, understanding the modeling, how and why those models function and how they inform policy. And then I'll also be doing the steps and tools to adapt. I'll be doing probably a separate video, just to keep things more concise. Right, so without further ado, Epidemiology 101, simple models. This right here is a graphic from Johns Hopkins University, provided using tools developed by Esri, the same company that produces ArcGIS and ArcGIS Pro, and Arc Online and those other tools. So Johns Hopkins, among others, have tried to consolidate information or testing data, confirmed cases, and other information about COVID-19, try to consolidate it and integrate it into data sets that can be used to inform the public, to inform policymakers, to inform people that might want to do some modeling. Although if you're doing robust modeling, you probably just go to the raw data sources themselves that Johns Hopkins pulls from. And so this graphic is they've developed every single day for every single county in the United States, and they have similar graphics for every country around the world. So if you may have heard of this already, but if you haven't, I would recommend it. It's not the only place to get information, but it's a good place, and I found it reliable for making informed decisions about travel decisions, what's going on in my own county in terms of like how safe things are or not safe, and things like that. But it also helps me just understand how different policies have then influenced the way cases have spread, and you can actually see this in the data, and it's useful for getting insight. So there's a lot of things I could talk about, but what I want to talk about right now is the number of cases in the last 14 days, this graphic on the right-hand side here. And so this is new cases for a given day. So -1 is 1 day prior, -2 is 2 days prior. And it shows you, it's a graph of how many cases were reported that day, new cases, confirmed cases for that day. And then if you integrate this, that is to add all of them up, you can get cumulative cases within that time period. And so this was done for Suffolk, Massachusetts, like I said, on December 21st. But you can also, you can break, there's a graphic for it, but you can also break this down to a table, so you can have the quantitative values that you can look at and use to build models. And so I have a spreadsheet set up where you have these tables. If you punch in the values for the last 14 days for any arbitrary region, you can get some kind of risk assessment that will inform the risk assessment tool that I will show in later slides. But you have this days prior to present, and then you have new confirmed cases of COVID-19 for that given day. And then you have cumulative cases up to the present, only for those last 14 days. So if you went further and back, it'd be a larger number, but this is cumulative cases within the last 14 days. This is, these total cases are nice, but it's also very useful to be able to do this as a portion of population for a variety of reasons. has to do with like probability of interactions and of someone that's susceptible to being infected versus someone that is infected, and so on and so forth. And so over here on the right-hand side, I have that. And so the links down below where I got this information, the leftmost link, Johns Hopkins has it for any county, country, so on and so forth. And this is the particular link for this particular county in Massachusetts, and it's updated daily. And so these population proportions are calculated with this population, this estimated population for that county in Boston. And so here I've graphed it. So these are cumulative cases. So I've gone ahead and integrated it. And so here are the cases, the total cases in the last 14 days as of 14 days ago, 13 days ago, 12 days ago, so on and so forth. And you'll see it seems to be in a line, right? This seemed pretty flat right here. And lo and behold, if you try to graph the cumulative cases, yes, it does seem to form a very linear relationship between time and cumulative cases. And if you do a linear curve fit, you'll find it's about 600 cases per day explains about 99.8% of the pattern. So it's a very, very high R-squared value. And so it's a, intuitively it looks linear, and, we have quantitative analysis that shows that it is linear. Although, as I'll show in a little bit, not all cases in a region or over time will spread linearly. In fact, if you don't have dampened controls on something that has a replication number higher than 1, you tend to have something that is approximated by exponential growth, at least initially. And so I also check in the spreadsheet that I shared in this model is that you check for exponential growth. And you'll notice that curve fit doesn't look as good, and also the R-squared value is not as high. So it's just not as good of a fit. So for this particular period and this particular location, a linear fit is better. And it's relatively, whichever has the R-squared value, I recommend that's probably, if it's higher, it's probably the one you want to go with. But if you have reason to believe that something definitely is linear, then you can use the linear. If you have something to believe that kind of looks linear, but almost certainly is exponential, you can go with the exponential model. And so that's just curve fitting, so you can get some parameters for then informing your risk assessment about how risky it is in that particular region at that time. And this doesn't account for all the cases over the course of the pandemic. So this right here is a graphic. This is new cases per day in Massachusetts. So not just Suffolk County anymore, over the course of the pandemic from in the beginning of 2020 to virtually the end of 2020, with the peak on December 19th. So here you had, initial slow growth, introduction of the disease, and then a rapid spread. And this was, early March, mid-April into May, where New York City, California, and Massachusetts were being hit really heavily with the disease, and hospitals were, at a breaking point. And so you can see the new cases per day was here. There were policies implemented. We were learning about how it would affect, we were still studying the disease, trying to understand what are effective controls to put into place to try to actually curb the spread. And it was damped to the point where the the social distancing and mask wearing and other policies that were put in place, business shutting down, it was enough to dampen the spread of the disease to the point where it flattened out here in the summer months. It is to note also that when people talk about flattening the curve, they don't mean this right here where the curve is flat, or this is where this flat. These are new cases per day. These new cases per day are really, really high, and that's not what you want. You want the cases to be low, so you want to dampen them to the point where they are suppressed down to really low levels. And it's still linear spread, but it's a much more manageable linear spread than up here, and much less risky, because if something goes amiss here, it's like, oh, you'll see a slight bump. If you have a mismanagement here, you can have a huge spike in cases. So the cumulative cases will flatten out and go horizontal when this number remains low. So right here, you'll have a linear growth that looks something like this, right? Where the cases are increasing every single day. Total cases are increasing. So you want to flatten out the cumulative cases, and that means the derivative goes to 0. And so this is, which is the new cases every day. And so you want that to go down to 0. So this flattened out for a while, and then gradually Massachusetts did a phased opening over the course of that summer to start to see how much risk, or how much, how relaxed the interventions could be, both in terms of social behavior and policies, to not have the disease spread out of control. And so this was done in a phased approach, rather to say, all right, can we do a little bit more? Can we do a little bit more? How much can we get away with, essentially, and keep other, sections of society running and operating, so people keep jobs and all those other things without, getting the disease out of control. In September, when notice around time schools were back in session, you started to see exponential growth again. You see this accelerating curve upwards of new cases. So not only did the cumulative cases increase, but the rate of increase of cases also increases, right? Because it's roughly exponential. So you see this accelerated curve. And then, you know, sometime in November, our government, Massachusetts government, realized that the cases were getting out of control. We were starting to hit levels comparable to the worst days earlier in the pandemic, and there were, you know, there was some retrograde policies put in place to try to dampen the spread of the disease, and that kind of entered this flatter stage here. So it wasn't quite as effective as it was back here. And so we had like a linear growth here where, you know, new cases per day was constant linear growth. And then right here in this 5-day period, we virtually doubled the number of new cases per day. And that was the 5 days immediately following Thanksgiving. So it's, you know, from a purely objective standpoint, it's not quite sure, we're not quite sure why that we suddenly saw this jump, but I don't think it's too much of a leap of intuition to imagine that has something to do with the societal behavior of wanting to get together and people gathering on Thanksgiving. Certainly, and it, you know, you essentially double the number of cases in 5 days, new cases per day. And so that was a big risk. And so now in this period, if you lived in this area like me, in Massachusetts, you've probably heard a lot of public service announcements talking, you know, discouraging people from getting together because this could double again, you know, after holiday celebrations if people weren't taking enough precautions and getting together and just hanging out inside without masks. Because you can be, as you probably know, you can be contagious without actually showing symptoms. But then a lot of people actually, it's still a very serious disease for them. So, anyways, so we're talking about the shaded region right here. So the data I'm talking about is this linear case right here. So I'm trying to talk about, all right, so the cases are up, it's a linear growth, it's not accelerating, but how do I assess the risk to me? What's, you know, this is, you know, seems pretty risky. I've heard public service announcement. What's the actual risk to me? How do I wrap my mind around that? How do I frame that risk? And how do I use that to inform my actions? And then also, how do my actions and the risk that I'm projecting onto the rest of the population, how do I manage that? So I want to talk about that. And I'm going to be looking at this particular case right here, where we're in a linear growth, or we were in a linear growth, so constant cases per day in December in this particular 14-day period, just as an example. But the model that I've put together can be used for any given region in any given 14-day period. So whether it's exponential or linear, so that you can get a sense of, you know, what the risk is in that region. And then I also want to talk about how our behaviors inform what risks we take, how that informs the aggregate systemic patterns that we see in the way a disease spreads, and how that we have models that can tell us, all right, well, here's what's going to happen long term, and here's the actual risk to society by taking certain policies or behaviors, stances. And this data, like I said, isn't just available for Massachusetts. It's available county by county from Johns Hopkins University for the United States, as well as country by country globally. There may be more granular information elsewhere. I know for Massachusetts, for instance, at least within Massachusetts, every single town, we have case numbers by town. Again, all anonymous. It's not, you know, private information. It's just total cases per day. And so let's talk about models that are actually used. One such model, or a very common basic model, is what's called the SIR model, or susceptible, infected, recovered model. And there's a bunch of different variations on this model, but this is a good starting point if you're not familiar with epidemiological models about how you can forecast the way diseases spread and understand their behavior within a society. So the idea is that you take, you know, the model is framing the idea of, if you're trying to model the number of cases over time and how the disease spreads, the idea is that you take, you frame the problem as saying, okay, you have a population and you divide that population into 3 groups: the susceptible population, the infected, and the recovered. So the susceptible are the individuals that have not been infected, but could become infected. And then there's I, which are the portion of the population, or those in the population that are infected. And then there's R, those that are recovered, or if you don't have a deceased category, those that did not survive the infection, but are no longer infectious because they recovered. This does not, there's a few assumptions in this model. One, that the population itself doesn't change dramatically, either due to births or people coming or leaving a particular region, like immigration or emigration. to a region. It also, there was another point that I had, but I'll think of it in a second. So the susceptible, right, the rate of change is susceptible. You move from susceptible to infected, right? If you can be infected, you'll, oh, that was my point, is that we know that in some cases you can get reinfected with COVID-19 and other diseases, but we do know that there's a significant amount of immunity that's built up. So for this, that would be an improvement for the model if you want to make it a little bit more refined about people that can get reinfected. But for a simple model like this, you can assume that once you've become infected, it's much less likely, or you can just model it, and this model is just assume it's impossible you get infected. Although there are certainly more nuanced models that deal with that. So this is saying that we want to go, this model says that people will move from the susceptible to the infected stage and then to the recovered stage. So the rate at which people move from the susceptible stage to the infected stage is proportional, this constant beta, and it's, I think n is a normalization constant, but in any case, there's just some constant that's multiplied by the product of the infected and the susceptible. So the more susceptible people are and the more infected people there are, in total, the product between the two, you get is the rate at which you have that transference. So it decreases the number of susceptible people and increases the number of infected people. And then you subtract the infected people, the rate of change from the infected people is constant. It's proportional to the total number of infected. So because all those people will recover at some constant rate gamma, and so they were moved from the infected population into the recovered population. So what happens is you get this effect where this model, which is verifiable, you can see this in actual epidemiological data, and in theory, it's very well founded. There are more nuanced approaches, but this is a very base model that you can start with. It shows like, okay, early on, there aren't too many people that are infected, so the spread's low, but then as the infection increases, more people that are infected, so the spread increases and is proportional to how many people are infected, but it's also proportional to the susceptible people. And as you infect more people, the number of susceptible people drops. And so there's this inflection point where you're increasing the rate of people that are infected, and then eventually they taper off because there's less people to infect. You can't infect more people than there are to infect. And certainly there's a portion of the population that will never get infected just because of chances, right? The way the dice fell. But certainly, the rate of infection and therefore the rate of recovery of people that are recovered starts to taper off and goes to, starts to horizontally go. So this is if there's no interventions at all. Is the way we can expect pandemics to run their course. And there's some variability here. If you had no interventions, you'll have, it doesn't go perfectly, in reality, it doesn't go perfectly asymptotic to the horizontal. It depends on a bunch of other factors. But you can read more about it in the links that I provide here on the slides, and I put in the description. So right here, these two boxes are talking about the rate of change from susceptible plus the rate of change with the infected plus the rate of change recovered is equal to 0. That is to say that the total number of people susceptible, infected, and recovered, they change which bin you fall in, and you can have a function describing that, but the model is saying that those are going to be constant, right? It's if you assume this, then it's an assumption, not strictly true, but pretty darn close. In most cases. And obviously, if you don't think that's a safe assumption, then you can't use this model. But in many cases, it's a good model. And including deaths would be the recovered. Right? So if there's really high deaths, you can still bin them and they're recovered. They didn't survive, but they're no longer infectious. And so for the purposes of trying to model how the infection spreads, there you go. Although you could have some diseases that spread after a person's deceased, but if you have proper management for deceased, the bodies of the deceased, then anyways, and epidemiological experts can talk more about that in other diseases where that might be a problem, but not really a concern here for this model, at least, when we're trying to talk about COVID-19. So R naught, you have beta divided by gamma, and R naught is the replication number. You might have heard about this. This is the expected number of individuals that an infected individual will infect over their infectious period. So the idea being that if R naught equals 1.5, it means that for every person or R naught equals 2, it means for every person that is infected, the expected value on average of the number of people that they will infect is 2. They'll infect 2 other people. And you can see how that can compound pretty quickly, right? You have 1 person that's sick, and then you have 2 people that are sick, then 4, and then 8, and 16. And so very rapidly, you can grow to these really big numbers. Again, you start to have a taper off because the number of people that can get infected falls away. But, right. And that's the difference between the exponential model and the logistic model. So this curve here, the blue curve, is the general curve for a logistic model. This is in differential form right now for this model. So I won't be dealing with the differential form. I'll be dealing, I'll be doing regression fitting to get parameters for doing a different functional form for the logistic model. But like this is the basis for how those are derived. And so this is a logistic model, which I'll talk about in a little bit. So I also want to talk about the parameters of the disease that are used to inform these models, both for the risk as well as the forecasting of how the disease will spread over time. So here, I'm just going to run through these parameters. And these are important. I list the sources here, so you can check the sources on the subsequent slides. I list what the source is for each of these numbers, and then I'll have them in the description as well. So the mean incubation period, C, is 5.2 days. So that's the time from when an individual becomes infected until they start to exhibit symptoms, if they were to exhibit symptoms. Again, this parameter, like many others, has a distribution, and in many cases, the distribution does impact the forecasting modeling and a few other properties, and especially in when it's like a close call, it might matter in terms of potential outcomes for the disease and whether or not how severe, how widely spread a pandemic will be. But certainly these are point estimates, and so for expected values. And so while the distribution can matter, and a more robust model would deal with the distribution, you can also do some modeling just with point estimates. And so that's what I've done here to keep things simple. And when I put it in a spreadsheet, I just have used a parameterized single point value to make the modeling a little bit simpler. And you can still get some useful insights, I would argue, from just doing point estimates for these. And the sources I talk about do talk about more robust modeling you can do with distributions. But here I'm trying to talk about the way the modeling is framed for risk and for forecasting. And I'm just adding the caveat that certainly if your intuition tells you there's a distribution here, you're correct. And certainly adding the doing a model that works with distributions can be is more robust, but has similar in many cases has similar attributes to just using the point estimates, although it's not as refined. So that's just to keep in mind, it's not just not knowing what the value is, but also there's variability. People recover, incubate at different rates, recover at different rates, so on and so forth. So, and then there is some unknown also in terms of actually estimating it. But I'm just using these point estimates as the best average point estimate. So days contagious prior to symptoms, this is the number of days. You might show symptoms after 5.2 days, but you'll be contagious 2 days beforehand, is our best estimates, at least to some degree. So I'm using that. Parameter value is 2. Asymptomatic portion of population is 0.4. So it's the portion of the population that does not and will not develop symptoms. And this varies widely, estimates for this, and it's kind of hard to get at. But, again, you can look at the range. There's ways of estimating this, but I'm using 0.4. The mean ratio of estimated infections to reported case count. So this is saying, this S is talking about the asymptomatic portion, but this is talking about the ratio of individuals that are not confirmed to unconfirmed cases to confirmed cases. Our best estimates show that, studies have shown that most cases go unconfirmed for a variety of reasons, whether it's asymptomatic or not getting tested or access to testing or whatever it is. But so for every one case that is confirmed from the data that we're looking at, we need to keep in mind there's probably 11 others. The estimates go as low as 6 and as high as, I forget what the other number is, but you can check the source. So I'm going to use 11, central estimate. Recovery period is the number of days to recover from the disease during which you are contagious. I treat it as, in my model, I have it as the days since being after the 5.2. So you become infected, you then have an incubation period, you become contagious and then show symptoms, and it's another 10 days to recover. I think I might be misciting this. You can check the references, but again, it's something on the order of 10 days. A couple weeks, right, is our best estimate for the recovery period. The reproduction number is the number of individuals that you would expect to infect. If an individual becomes infected, the number of people that over the course of the infectious period, that individual is expected to infect. The central estimate The CDC list is 2.5, but 2.7 is well within the range. And I used 2.7 because that way I could use natural logs and I could use exponents, a natural exponents E. And it just made mathematics a little bit simpler, so I chose it. It's very close to the central estimate. It was just, so I just chose 2.7. The mean generational and it's not arbitrary. I mean, you could say that, like, yeah, I could go for the central estimate, but I'm trying to get a qualitative sense of how, the nature of these models and the nature of the disease. And in some cases, R0 does vary depending on regions. So there's almost certainly some regions where 2.7 actually is probably the best estimate. So, but overall, globally, 2.5 is the estimate that is cited by the CDC, Center for Disease Control, in the United States government. The mean generational interval is 5.4 days. So it's the period from when an individual becomes infected to the amount of time that lapses before they infect the next individual. So they're expected, because they are not to infect more people after that, but it's the mean time from the initial infection to the second infection. This matters for modeling how quickly the disease spreads. But it's not, so this is the amount of time before the next infection happens, and this is the total number of infections over the infectious period for an individual that's sick and infectious. Portion of infected that are hospitalized. I should say, sorry, infectious and sick are different, right? Because you can be infectious without actually feeling bad, right? So this is for an infectious person. Number of time from it for an infectious person to infect the next person. Portion of infected that are hospitalized is useful for getting at the severity of a disease, but as well as helping get estimates for the spread of the disease, because you can actually track how many people are hospitalized. Estimated case fatality ratio. This is really tricky because this is the portion of people that have confirmed cases that for which the disease will be lethal and they will not survive. This is difficult to use in modeling because it varies widely based on testing availability and how diseases are reported. Like, it's hard to do. I find it more useful for at least the concept, the concepts I'm trying to deal with and show. Estimated infection fatality ratio, IFR, is more useful because it's harder to get at because you have to estimate how many cases are actually existing, and you have to try to figure out a way to standardize, how testing is handled. But with those estimates, you can then say, okay, well, I have a sense of how severe the disease is. It's the portion of individuals that will not survive an infection if they become infected. So this is if their infection is confirmed, right? And that varies just based on a bunch of things, including the IFR and the testing. But IFR is a more direct measurement, although harder to get at and actually measure from publicly available data about how lethal a disease is. But it's, estimates put it like above 1% to a little bit below 0.7%. So 0.007 is 0.7% of individuals that become infected with COVID-19 are expected to not survive and die due to the disease, which is pretty significant, right? Okay. Sorry, I cut out there for a second. Right, so I was talking about the right here, estimated infection fatality ratio, 0.7. 0.7% is you're talking about, even in the US, you're looking at if the disease went left unchecked, you're talking about millions not surviving. Right, so it seems like a small percentage, but given the size of the population, it's pretty significant. All right, there we go. All right, and so these parameters right here are parameters that I'm going to be using. These are mostly parameters that I use for my own modeling, and so I want to talk about what those parameters mean. So when you look at my algebra that I've shared in some of the other slides and in links in the references, that you know what I'm talking about. So region population is P, and that varies based on your region. Estimated maximum total infection asymptote, L. So it's for the logistic model, and I calculate L as a function of P and R0. And so there might be a metric that's I believe there might be a metric that's slightly better for this, but this is the one that I use. So it's just population times 1 minus the reciprocal of the replication number for getting, something that's in the rough ballpark of the total number of individuals that will become infected over the course of the pandemic. The exponential growth rate, is the natural log of replication number divided by the mean generational period. And this actually is affected by the distribution of the generational period. So this is the upper bound estimate, which I think if I'm trying to assess risk is, err on the side of caution, use the upper bound. But sometimes in some cases, based on the distribution, is actually can be very close to the estimate. And so the source here, I got this from the source, and they talk about, how that's affected and the mathematics behind that. So the other thing that I did do is this is the formulation for an exponential growth, and I adopted it for using a logistic growth model. So again, it's fudging some edges a little bit, but like qualitatively, it's in the right ballpark is my hope, or my expectation rather, I guess. And again, if there's, as I don't know of another metric that I could use for estimating the growth rate. So again, if you're an epidemiologist or you do this professionally, and you have, hey, there's like a better metric for estimating the exponential growth rate, feel free to give me some feedback or criticism. I appreciate it. And then there's the horizontal shift, which is the natural log of L minus 1 divided by the growth rate. L, so the maximum L, this L. And essentially, it's just a horizontal phase shift for the model to make sure that all models, as you vary the R0 number, like that they all are comparable, so that you have the same starting population of infected individuals. So that you can shift and compare the models and they all line up correctly. But it also you can interpret the value also. If you see this, you look at the X0 value, and it's like, in this case that I deal with, I estimate to be 71 in the model that I show. This means it's 71 days from the initial infection in a region till the point where you would see the maximum rate of infection, or the inflection point, the point where the curve starts to go from concave up to concave down in the logistic curve. And so it's the number of days that will pass before you see the maximum number of infections per day and the biggest caseload, before things start to improve, but will, could still be severe for a while afterwards. And that's, X0 if the disease goes unchecked. But it's dependent on R0 and the mean generational interval. So again, R0 is very significant for these models, as I'll show in some of the graphics later. Total infected is I. The portion of the population infected is I sub p. The transmission rate is a parameter that I just tuned to be able to assess some kind of risk of disease transmission from an infectious person to a susceptible person. And the so this is saying this is 0.36 is 3.6%. So this is saying for typical interaction, whatever that means, right? It's a little vague, but for typical interaction, you have 3.6% of those interactions between a susceptible person and an infectious person would have the susceptible person become infected. And this is I tuned this based, and I'll talk about how I tuned this essentially, but essentially I tuned the model to try to fit the R0 number, assuming some kind of structure about how people interact. And that's very, that's difficult to do because they don't actually have information about directly how people interact. There's another study that I didn't fit in here in the slides, but I want to be able to cite, that was done by Johns Hopkins University, talking about how networks actually influence the way the disease spreads. Which it does, it's just it's hard to quantify. But they actually did a study trying to look at that, looking at anonymous transit data and relate that to the rate of spread of the disease COVID-19 through the population. All right, so N sub VF is the numbers in a virtual family, or you can think of this as your actual family or your pod. It's the number of people that you interact with, in a close proximity. You hang out in a room, or you talk to outside without a mask or something like that. And so these are the people that I would, in this model that I've done for risk, are people that if one of you becomes infected with COVID-19, you're likely to transmit it to the other person, because there's minimal boundaries or barriers, or you see each other so often or have such close contact in some regard that you should be considered part of the same pod. Certainly, the people they socialize with, and as I argue, like keeping that small has a huge impact. Daily virtual family interactions with others. So this is outside the individuals. Your cluster can be 5 people that you interact with regularly. It's how many other people in the population that you would interact with cumulatively. So each one of the individuals interact with a certain number of people in the public outside that group. And then if you add up all those for a given day, a typical day, that's the daily number of interactions with the public, with others. Daily probability of self-infection, so it's of a member in the pod, assuming that if one person in the pod or virtual family or family gets infected, they would infect others. What's the risk of that? The probability per day is y, the variable y. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. And then the I sub G, I sub L, I sub E are all the total infected as a function of days that are the logistic, linear, and exponential models respectively. Then you have the slope, vertical shift, vertical scale factor, and growth rate for the linear and exponential models. These are the parameters that I just get from doing a regression fitting of the 14-day period data. All right, and so these are the references that I used. These will be in the description again. And I may add a few others, specifically like the Johns Hopkins study that I just cited. All right. And I will also be listing the other, sources in the description as well, that are in the other slides as well, not just here for these are all the parameters. These are all the references for the parameters. All right. So here we can see this is a logistic curve. And so this is my best estimate for what would happen in Suffolk County if the COVID-19 infection was not, no mitigation strategy was done at all. Like it was just ignored. After 71 days, you would reach your inflection point where you have the maximum rate of infection. And then after 100 days or so, infections would start to really taper off. You'd continue to have a few. And this is using a logistic model right here. This L over 1 minus e to the negative k1 x minus x naught. X is the independent variable, and x naught, k1, and L are all the other variables, and e is just the natural exponent. And so this is not actually the case because we actually did take some interventions, but this is me trying to model and say, all right, what was my forecast given a certain R naught number? And I did talk about how the parameters are sensitive to the distribution. They're sensitive to, we don't have exact estimates, but I do an analysis with, as those estimates vary, either because we get better measurements or they vary because of societal shifts or policy changes. If there are not shifts, I've done a sensitivity analysis, at least, doing a few different cases about what different R naughts would look like. And so a replication number values would look like. And so you can see, how much, how the steepness and the total infected would shift in this logistic model as the replication number changes. So what the forecast would be for a given replication number. And that is dependent, as I will show, on the risk that we all take collectively. And the average risk that we, in the mod, it all depends on the behavior that we exhibit. And so I want to talk about that both when I'm talking about risk, both in terms of the risk that I'm taking because of whatever the cases are in the area, but also how then the risks that I take influence the systemic risks that everyone in the population deals with in the short term and long term. But I just wanted to tease you a little bit in talking about, okay, here's what a curve would look like, and here's my best estimate. But let's talk about how would we talk about risk and how does that risk inform the R and the risk that we take inform the replication number. And what that means for forecasting how the COVID-19 and other similar diseases would spread in a population. All right, so if I want to talk about risk to myself, okay, I'm going to branch off and talk about risk for individuals or a single cluster. And you're wondering about, like, all right, what's safe for me to do, right? I wanted to develop a tool where you can start to actually get some objective sense and perspective based on case data and hard science and mathematics about, what's the actual risk, not just some vague sense about I feel safe, right? Or I feel like this is too risky, right? You want some objective measurement. So I want to talk through my algebra a little bit, and I've made this available, but I just want to talk about it. But you can, check my algebra by following some of the links provided above. Here. Okay. So daily confirmed cases, this for the exponential case, this requires you need to, it's the first derivative of the e sub e of x function. So it's in an exponential, so I did curve fitting for an exponential case for cumulative cases, but if you take the derivative of that or the new cases per day and do a curve fitting for that, you have, you know, you can get the derivative just by taking that function and taking the derivative, and so it has this functional form here. We have the new cases per day for any given day, given those parameters. So if you're seeing an exponential growth in a region, you can say, okay, well, I can have this model to know what the daily confirmed cases are, you know, X days out. And the reason, you know, where X is 0 being today and then X1 being the next day and so on and so forth. 7.6 right here, the reason you add that is because of a delay in reporting, as well as the mean generational interval. A lot of individuals have become infected and are spreading the disease, and new people are getting infected at a rate faster than what the data yesterday would be able to show you because of just the nature of the disease. So this is what you have to do. You have to do a horizontal shift to be able to, what you will be measuring in 7.6 days is what it actually is now, essentially what this is saying. So that's why if you want to know what's going on now, you take the model and project out 7.6 days and then infer that that is what's going on now. And so you have daily confirmed cases by, I'm trying to see if there's something else I want to say about this. I might come back to it, but I'm going to keep going. Daily confirmed cases by portion of population. So you can just take the daily confirmed cases and divide by the population, and then you have by portion of population. Then you have daily total cases. So these are confirmed cases, but remember we talked about how a lot of cases go unconfirmed. So you have this T+1, which is the 11 plus 1. So it's 11 to 1 ratio, which means you need to multiply by 11 plus 1 in order to get the total cases. Because it's the unconfirmed plus the confirmed, and so that's why it's the plus 1 for the multiplier. And then you can divide by P and get the daily total cases that are confirmed and unconfirmed, an estimate for that by portion of population. And you have this for every single day, right? But this is not cumulative cases, right? And so if you're worried about, you know, if you care about how contagious people are in the population, you need the cumulative case count that have moved from susceptible to the infectious period, but you have not yet moved from infectious to recovered. And to do that, what you need to do is you need to sum up all those values. And so here I've broken it down into two summations. So here, actually, this is the same equation. I've just written out more explicitly in the bottom line. You break this out into two summations for the portion of the population that is contagious and the portion of the population that is not contagious, right? Because those that are, I'm sorry, not contagious, symptomatic. Those that are not symptomatic, asymptomatic, S stands for asymptomatic, as you recall from the table. So the asymptomatic portion of the population, because they don't know that they are contagious, they will be in the population and mix with the population longer, right? And so there's this period where, I'm assuming that's the case, right? In general, right? Maybe there's a particular case where one person doesn't interact with the public, but most people will still be going about their business in the public, right? So this sums up all those cases, the daily cases for that period for which they would be contagious, right? And then here you also have to add those that are contagious but are symptomatic, and I'm assuming that those individuals would isolate and not try to expose the public. And so that period of exposure is much shorter, and so it's just this value right here, negative n, which is the the days you're contagious before you show symptoms. And then again, I'm multiplying by T+1 to get the total cases rather than just those the confirmed case, because this function only deals with confirmed cases. And then you can just take those functions, divide by P, and you get the currently contagious portion of the population in the public. So you can get the total of individuals that are contagious in the public, and the portion of the population that's currently contagious. And so that was the exponential case. And the linear case is the same thought process, except it's a little bit simpler mathematically, because you don't have to worry about the rate of change of, because if you're assuming it's linear, then you're saying, all right, well, my rate of infections doesn't change over time. So you would have to shift 7.6 days into the future, but that if you're assuming it's constant, it's still the same rate of infection. So you don't have to worry about that. So you can just say, all right, the rate of infection, M, is going to be the same. And so when I'm trying to count up all the currently contagious people, I can just use that linear value for the last 14 days. And then just do the summation for the at a constant rate. Is much easier to do, or much more direct to do. The notation's simpler, certainly. Right, but it's the same thought process. So you have daily confirmed cases by portion of the population, total cases, and then you add up all those for the last few days, and then you can express that as total people or portion of the population. Now, because we wanted to look at that portion of the population, we wanted to look at that case in the 14 days prior to December 21st, 2020 in Suffolk, Massachusetts. That's what I'm going to do is for this particular case. I'm just going to move myself up there a little bit, clear that number. Okay. So here I talked about having to, and I also wanted to be able to look at that risk. So if we had, all right, well, the title should be slightly different. I meant to have a different title, but that's all right. We're going to keep going. So current contagious in the public, the linear case, right, corresponds to these. So these cases refer to these calculations here. So daily confirmed cases is 600. Daily total cases is you just you multiply by that factor to count the people that are not confirmed. And then currently contagious persons, is equation 5. So using the data from the 14-day period prior to the December 21st in 2020 in Suffolk, Massachusetts, you get 47,520 according to this model. And then the currently contagious portion of the population is 0.06. That's 6% of the population that is actively contagious in the public by this estimate, by this model. And this is something I feel pretty good about. Not good about, but like I feel like this is, it's probably a fairly good estimate. The things that I talked about that I was a little more nebulous on in the parameters had more to do with the forecasting of how rapidly the disease spreads. But I'm using parameters here that are all pretty well understood and documented by experts. They weren't things I had to estimate, but I'm just doing some algebra to be able to discern expected number of people that are contagious in the population based on the cases that we're seeing, as is informed in my model being informed by those parameters. So 6%, that's 6 out of every 100 people that you would see in public in that region on December 21st or 22nd would be contagious. 6 out of 100. So and they wouldn't show signs, and the way I've modeled this is they wouldn't show signs of being contagious. And it's not that they've been infected, it's the number of infected people in the public is even higher. The number of total infections is even high, and contagious is even higher because a lot of people are quarantining after they become infectious. This is people that are actively in the public, unaware that they're contagious, but actually are risking infecting other people. And certainly on a large scale, the odds are virtually impossible that people won't get infected at a consistent rate, or at some rate, right? So, and this is so this has nothing to do. So this would be if individuals were this is with current regulations and with current precautions that have been taken. So unless there's a dramatic shift in that 14-day, right at the end of that 14-day period, or right before that, where you're looking at this data, this is the expected number of people. So that's pretty high, right? 6 out of 100. Like you just driving down the street, you're walking down the street, you're going to see, especially in Suffolk, where there's a high population density, a good number of people are infectious. Although you wouldn't necessarily know that without having some kind of but you wouldn't have an idea of who. And so certainly I'd say, again, that's why when the caseloads were, this is in that same period back here, where that was 6% right around here. That's taking this data that I can infer using this model that 6% of the population is actively infectious in the public. And that's why taking precautions is really important, and why there were a lot of public service announcements, I would argue, for trying to keep people safe. So I think intuitively a lot of people would recognize that's really high, but then I also wanted to create something that's more general and just saying, okay, well, given a caseload in a region, you can get that estimate for currently contagious number of individuals. What's the actual risk to me? Like, how do I quantify that in terms of me getting sick or people I care about getting sick? Are there extra precautions I should be taking? Because of, for whatever reason, the disease got out of control, which has to do with behaviors prior to that point. and the nature of the disease. So the rate of transmission, I talked about this parameter earlier that I just used to tune the rate of transmission to get the correct R0 number, assuming certain things about the way people were mixing together. This is the algebra I followed for being able to do it. I don't want to dive into it, but essentially it comes out to the rate of transmission is approximately equal the replication number -1 divided by the average daily interactions with others and times the days infectious in public. So the and so I took these parameters and assumed something about the daily interactions with others. I knew, here the days infectious in the public from these the integrations that I did before, and then I know R0, so I got the rate of transmission. So, but I had to essentially play around with these. I, iterated this process a bunch of times until I got an R0 that was roughly 2.7. So I tuned this a whole bunch to be able to make sure that this worked out. So that's how I was able to estimate rate of transmission. But once I got there, and so it's essentially the risk of transmission from a susceptible person to an infectious from an infectious person to a susceptible person. And again, there's variability, but I'm going to talk about that in a second. So if I have the daily and so now if I just do some probability, some basic probability calculations, right? The daily probability of self-infection Y equals is this right here. It's the portion of the population that's contagious times the transmission rate for a single interaction is the likelihood, because you don't know if someone's infectious or not, if you're not infected. The probability that you actually would get infected. And it's actually pretty low, but keep in mind you're repeating that every single time you have an interaction, and any time a member of your virtual family does. They're also putting you at risk by interacting with others. They're putting you at risk for infection by interacting with others. And so this is a repeated exposure, and I'm assuming an independent cases. So interacting with one person does not increase or decrease your rate of infection in the next interaction. And so you can just calculate the probability daily that's dependent on the number of interactions happening, the portion of the population is contagious, and the transmission rate, and you can get the daily probability of self-infection. And that, I'm saying that everyone in your pod and virtual family would become infected. Cumulative probability of self-infection is the amount. So essentially, you can do a similar kind of analysis for saying, okay, so this is my daily risk of infection, but then I'm repeating that every single day, right? Because I'm saying this is my average interactions, and then over time, I'm going to keep repeating that. So you're going to keep risking that someone in the family is going to contract a disease, in this case, COVID-19, right? And so it's just 1 minus y raised to the power of the duration of the days, number of repeat cases. And then also there's this equation where I talk about, so that's the risk to the self, but then there's also the risk to the other. And there's an interesting nuance here that I do want to talk about in just a little bit, but I'm not quite there yet. But the expected number of others infected, which is the rate of transmission times the number of interactions times the amount of time you would be exposed to the public before, if you had been infected. There's a slight hand waviness knowing here with testing that's available now. I'm assuming that either your entire family is going to be symptomatic or not symptomatic or asymptomatic. And that's not necessarily true. So it's actually, this is again, probably upper bound on the risk that you're posing to others, as long as you have testing available for at least, and people are paying attention to symptoms. But we don't really have a sense for, there's so much variability in the way family structures work and access to testing. I was just like, I'm just going to assume that either everyone's going to be symptomatic or not. And this is maybe an okay assumption for as long as those pods are small. For very large pods, this becomes less and less significant. But I would argue that most guidelines and regulations and best practices and the science suggests that that's a very risky behavior and does not effectively help prevent the spread of the disease anyways. So try to limit your social interactions anyways. So this is an okay assumption for small numbers, for small pods, small family. The idea here is I want to talk a little bit about the way I framed, actually calculating risk. So these calculations, how I did that. And the idea is that, look, let's say you have 8 family members, right? So this is just, an example of maybe you have 8 family members all living together. or maybe 2 households of 4 that interact directly because the kids get together and play or something. And I don't know, they're just there for social support. They're direct neighbors. And they just said, all right, we're going to be a pod together. But a lot of people are taking precautions. You can say, how many interactions does each person have with the public on average per day? And I'd say average this over the course of a week, right? Because there'll be times where you're doing more acute exposure, and given the incubation period of 5.2 days, it's reasonable that a week is a good time to average that period. We can get a good sense of. Anyways, I don't want to get too much into that, but for a week, just try to estimate what your daily interactions are with the public. In this case, it's 1 for this person. And every day they're interacting with one other person in the public. This person's 1, this person's 1.3, right? Because an average, doesn't have to be whole number values. 15, 4, 5, 7, 2.5. And you add these up and you get the total number of interactions per day that the people in this pod or this virtual family would interact with in the public, right? Because each one of those interactions puts everyone else in the pod at risk. I'm assuming that these people, if someone in this pod were to become infected, they would transmit it to everyone else. And there are a few exceptions that may exist that I've heard of, but they seem to be rare. And I don't think there's any science that suggests we know why someone, if they're infectious, isn't quite as infectious as other people to the point where you could be in the same room and not get infected by them. I wouldn't bank your risk assessment on that. That certainly doesn't seem to be the case given how high the R0 number is in most cases. Okay, yeah. So this is just, so I'm just repeating what I talked about up here. It's the same slide. And I do want to mention that again, what's meant by an interaction. Closer interactions, prolonged interactions with less barriers do have higher risk. And so the risk, the R sub T that I have right here that I calculated is a distribution based on the nature of the interaction. So like if you're going to a grocery store, you're interacting with like maybe dozens of people, right? If you're inside a store, but they're all very weak interactions. And so the risk from any one of those is less than maybe just talking to 2 people inside, but directly for like 15 minutes, right? The CDC tries to say, all right, it's within 6, it's around a 6-foot range for 15 minutes or longer counts as an interaction. But you could define that as a typical interaction. You could find the number of interactions that corresponds to the same level, that has a risk that corresponds to the same level of risk as all those weak interactions in a larger crowd, but that you're not there very long and you're, and a lot of that depends also on circulation for the building. Are you outside versus inside? A lot of different things. But at some point you need to say, all right, here's a typical interaction, and then you can tune the parameters around it to still make the model work and like that. But understand that like the risk actually is very dependent on precautions you're taking, barriers you're using, distance, and time of exposure, and environmental factors like inside, outside, temperature, humidity, things like that. And there are a lot of studies that have gone into that. And I've linked to some about the efficacy of masks. I talk about the efficacy of testing, and I'm going to do in another video, but just I wanted to point that out. So I'm just talking about like a typical interaction, just to keep the model simple, point estimate for what the, that risk of transmission is for that particular interaction. And so here, for instance, this person might go to the grocery store once a week. And so I'm just saying once per day. I know it's a lot more people. When you go, I'm thinking it's like 7 interactions going to the grocery store. That might be how I think about it, right? And that's kind of hard to pin down, and I don't have a hard answer for that. But you can at least comparatively say someone that just goes to the grocery store once a week is probably less risky than someone that goes to the grocery store twice a week and also works directly with 10 different people every single day in the general public, right? And so they're certainly going to be higher by several orders of magnitude. Anyways, but you can add up these number of virtual interactions. And so this is just something I'm just trying to understand and create this framework, right? So it's a little bit of fuzzy, but you can try to pin down a few discrete values, and you can play with those discrete values and kind of see how the model changes in terms of the risk. And so I've created a link to this spreadsheet so you can play around with it, but just wanted to discuss that caveat so that you can have a bit of better sense of what the limitations in the model are, but also, how it's useful and what it means. So 36.8 interactions, let's just say, for your virtual family program. Now, given this, if you do these calculations, you can then come up with this table. So this is for a replication number of 2.7. I'm assuming a family size of 8 persons, and interactions, 8 interactions. per person per day. And this yields a risk factor of 0.36. So I tune these values, assuming this about the number of interactions, the number of people, you can tune this to be able to get the replication, I'm sorry, not the replication number, the risk of transmission from a single interaction. And so essentially what I've done here is here's a table in the leftmost column. Here, each of these rows is labeled by the number of interactions that the family has. 36.8 was what I gave back here. So 36.8 would put us right around here, right down here, in this orange row. And so here's the daily risk for, and then this is for Suffolk, Massachusetts. So on December 22nd. So given what we're seeing in the daily cases, we have a guess for 6% of the population. So 6% of the population is actually contagious. So given that, and given 36.8 interactions, you're looking at 7.2% probability that someone in that small group of people is going to become sick any given day. And then over time, what's the cumulative probability that over the 15 days someone's going to get sick? That's 67.88%, and that's even with a lot of people taking a lot of precautions. And so that's why that 6% is actually really high, because of the repeated exposure to infectious individuals before they would stop becoming infectious. And so, that's why I think there was so much pushback saying, hey, this is a really risky environment. You might want to take a lot of precautions, really decrease the amount of social interactions you have, maybe cancel holiday plans, things like that, because the risk is so high given the current, number of cases active in the community. So that's how to interpret this graph, and I've linked to it later in the later slide, and where you can actually play around with the numbers and start to get a sense of, okay, given this caseload in this region, here's kind of risk I'm expecting. Also, based on my pod size, how many people, how many people are in my pod, but also how many people my pod interact with, right? So you could stretch this number and get more people if everyone in those people is more like VFM1 here, this person or this person. But if you have people that are acting like this and interacting with a lot more with the public, you're going to have a comparable risk much more quickly with very few members. So even 15 alone, that one person alone, this is the risk they're looking at for themselves, according to this model. And certainly qualitatively, there's this pattern, right? So these numbers could be fudged a little bit in terms of estimating the parameters, but the behavior, the qualitative behavior of these models will still have the same kind of pattern. And one pattern that's really interesting that I do want to talk about is right here, you have expected number of people your virtual family would infect. So this is given your behavior pattern, your interactions with the public, assuming that, if one person gets infected in your family, everyone gets infected. How many people would you infect? Well, you can see how many people you'd expect to infect. And this right here is if everyone was doing what you were doing and copying your behavior patterns, this effectively would be the R0 number, right? So unless, you think there's a special exemption from what other people are doing, or you should be a different exemption from other people are doing, like this, this is the number of people you'd expect, that everyone would expect to infect over time. And so if this is numbers above 1, right? In reality, this is the estimate, but if it actually isn't above 1, this estimate might be off. So it might actually be 6, right? Where you hit R0 of 1. Then you will have growth. And that's where you enter that logistic model that I showed earlier, is where the pandemic will spread and the disease will spread and cases will rise, rapidly. Or they'll accelerate the rate of their spread, right? And so I put these in green because this is half the, with estimates could be off. So to be conservative, I'd say, all right, we'll keep, your interactions from your pod per day down to 6 or lower, right? But again, those estimates could be off. Like the, your interactions inside a store, if the store is using circulated air without filters, could be a lot higher just going to the store, because then you're interacting virtually heavily. Those interactions are heavy for 30 people rather than just 7 people, right? And so those interactions could be a lot higher, and the risk could be higher. Because we know aerosol is in breathing is air transmission is the primary vector of transmission for the disease COVID-19. So, but this is how you can frame that risk. An interesting thing here about the number of people you would infect is, if you look back at this equation, is that it's not dependent on the current caseload. It's only dependent on the number of interactions that you and your family have with others and the risk of transmission. And that, it's hard to know exactly what that is, but the riskier the interaction, certainly the more people you'd expect to infect. And it's also dependent on how long you're exposing folks to. So the RE plus N times T plus N times 1 minus T is just the expected duration that you would interact with the public before you wouldn't be contagious anymore. And so that's interesting. And I think the interesting thing here is this right here, all these columns here, 1 through 120 on the top here, all talk about personal risk. But the risk to others and the way the forecasting for the disease, how it will spread, does not depend on the current caseload. As long as there's one infectious person, it depends only on the cumulative behavior patterns of everyone. So if you wanted to control a disease, everyone would have to limit your interactions or somehow reduce R sub T to the point where the risk of transmission is so low that the R naught is critically damped below 1 and the disease fades away. And so, technically speaking, everyone else in the community could be doing this and you could be taking lots of risks, and it probably wouldn't spread because other people wouldn't be replicating your behavior patterns. So, but unless you think there's a reason why you should be an exception for interactions with other people and taking risks, and other people should have to do more restrictions and have to do more work than a particular, your family unit or something like that, or an individual thought that, right? Then these are the restrictions that if everyone is being uniform, right? That's what I'm trying to say. This is how the model would have to, you'd have to follow these restrictions in order to keep the disease lower. Strictly speaking, you could have some people who are taking on more risk and not be impacted because everyone else is taking more precautions and protecting those people. So this is more like this model is assuming everyone's behaving the samely, is behaving the same, and you could look at it, even if you had a distribution of behavior, you can look at central estimates of what that behavior looks like and how this will spread. So you could look at an R naught number, an estimate for the R naught number, and infer what kind of interactions people are having on average, right? Some riskier, some less risky. And there are estimates. I do link to some sources that talk about how to estimate R naught, the replication number, in real time as it changes. Because as you can see here, the replication number does depend on your interactions, and it does depend on R sub T in equation 10 here. So as soon as that clears, yeah. So R sub T, number of interactions and the transmissibility. So certainly how risky your interactions are and the number of interactions are the things that directly impact the long-term viability of spread of a disease like COVID-19. Right, so I want to talk about, we know that those things, the severity of interactions, from looking at that modeling, we can see that the severity of interactions as well as the number of interactions that a pod does directly affects R naught, the replication number. And so I talked about, here's my best estimate for a replication number where people take no precautions whatsoever, either systemically or as individuals. And here's how the total cases would change over time. But I also want to talk about how this model can be shifted with the replication number and what those different models look like. So just for a little bit, I want to talk about behavior of logistic functions as you change some of these variables, specifically L, K1, and X naught. So here you can see, all right, you have different K naught. So these are your growth rates. So how quickly the disease is modeled to spread. Which depends on if you recall, on the replication number as well as the mean generational interval. And so here, if it's a really low growth rate, you have a very, very relatively slow spread, although you still have saturation around 125 days, whereas a very high spread, you're having saturation close to around 75 days. All right, and you'll notice that, so this is all with the same X naught, and this is all with the same L. And then you could vary L. Varying L is the saturation, essentially the asymptote for the logistic function. And so if you have different L's, you can say, all right, well, I'm going to have a maximum infection of 100,000 people. You can say, all right, well, you're going to follow this curve, and it's not going to be as steep, right? Or it's going to be this curve, or this curve, or this curve, or this curve. They all kind of reach their saturation around the same time. They all reach the saturation around the same time, but because the total infected is lower, it's not as steep. This actually doesn't happen in reality. I'm just talking about what happens, the behavior of logistic functions as you shift out. And I will talk about, I have a slide that talks about what happens if you actually shift R naught and how it affects all these parameters, which I talked about earlier in the table, but I'm going to show it graphically. So here it's just X naught, you're shifting X naught. You're just taking the same model and just shifting it over. Remember I talked about how it was just a shift to make the models align correctly. So here you can just see, like, you're assuming different points for when the infection started. And obviously it follows the same trajectory. Everything else being constant, it's just when do you have to deal with that infection in the public, in the spread of an infection like COVID-19 in the public. All right, but all these values are dependent on R naught. Right, and so here, I have to move my face again. There we go. You can see that this function, logistic function, the parameters are informed by R naught. And so I'm just pulling this from the table that I showed earlier, where L is the population times the critical immunization threshold, 1 minus 1 over R naught. The growth rate is dependent on the natural log of the replication number divided by the generational interval, and X naught, just to make everything shift and align correctly, this is how you would calculate it. And it's also the time you can interpret it as the time from the first infection to the point of critical, the most infections per day. And so here I've plotted out several R naughts just so you can see the sensitivity of what we can expect to have happen with the way the disease transmits in a population given a particular R naught. And so at R naught 1, I'll talk about 0.9 in a second because it's, this model actually isn't accurate for those that range. You can't have negative cases. R naught, at least for this model, right? I'm not gonna get into some abstract mathematics, right? But we're just talking here, like R naught equal to 1 is to say for every one person that gets infected, they pass it to one other person. Well, you expect the number of infections just to stay constant. It's not going to go anywhere. And this is assuming there's no static or variability, right? If R naught gets a little higher, then oh yeah, you are going to have the logistic spread. It's going to grow more or less exponentially. Then it's going to start to taper off, and then plateau, and the pandemic will be over, right? And it's much less steep, and you don't get as many people infected with lower R naught numbers. So there's like a different, you can see the difference. Like there's this huge gap in the total number of people that would ever even be affected by the disease with a lower R naught. Just because you start to develop herd immunity, or you can decrease this with artificial immunization, shots, vaccines. But you can see as R naught increases, it increases the steepness, but it also increases the total number of people affected. So 1 is the total number of people infected increases. So it's potentially harmful. More people are going to die in total. But also the steepness can become a problem because of overwhelming hospitals and healthcare workers. R naught 2.5 is this orange curve right here. I used 2.7, so the one I showed earlier is slightly steeper. But you can see if as you vary R naught going up to 3, you can see how much it shifts, and going down to 2 comes down here. You can kind of see how, what the sensitivity. So realistically, you'd look for a curve somewhere in here you'd expect for reality. So there might be some variability in R naught, but you have a range between this blue curve and this green curve. It might be a reasonable estimate to think about what would actually be the trend, what would be the long range forecast for this disease. And in any case, these are really steep in terms of potentially overwhelming hospitals. Given how the impacts this disease can have on an individual. And certainly it does influence the maximum number of people that we'd expect to be infected. So yeah, I just wanted to show this so that you can see how the relationship that I want to draw attention to is how the behaviors of individuals and how they interact with people. And again, these numbers are just kind of, think of these as qualitative, like this pattern. Like again, the numbers, I'm not an epidemiologist. They will follow, I'm confident they will follow this pattern, although the exact threshold of what's safe and not safe is hard to estimate. But certainly it seems plausible that it's on the lower end here. Somewhere in this range. These risks, and even Massachusetts, we didn't quite know what was too risky in terms of policies, and that's why we had that phased opening to try to get a sense of like, okay, well, how can we keep shifting up on this graph to get as much, interaction and function as we can without slipping over the 1 R naught equal to 1 threshold. So those interactions directly impact the number of people you expect to infect, which is the R0 number, and the R0 number directly impacts the total number of people you expect to infect, as well as the growth rate, how quickly and how severely healthcare systems will be stressed. And the mortality rate can increase if people won't receive the care that they need, right? So, all right, and so this was my best guess. So this is for Suffolk County specifically. No particular time, just from the beginning of an outbreak to the end of an outbreak if no intervention was done. And these R0s can shift depending on mask wearing, right? Because also keep in mind that to calculate expected number of others infected is also dependent on the rate of transmission. So I want to talk about that in just a little bit. So precautions that you can take, right, will impact, you know, the way this curve plays out. And if nothing was done, you'd have an R0 of 2.7 roughly, mean generational period of 5.4 days. Maximum, you'd infect a total of about 500,000 people in that county alone. This would be your growth rate in 71 days before you've reached the maximum rate of infection. And the things that we do to shift R0 can change that to be more manageable or even damped out to the point, you know, 1 and below, you have a linear spread, which is much more manageable. Then I wanted to show what happens if you go below 1. The model kind of breaks down, it goes negative, right? Not really applicable for R0s less than 1, but we do know there are other models for that case, which show that it just kind of stays in this, you know, have this linear hopping around of this linear growth rate of total infections because you'd have the disease still hopping around pockets of the population. But the other thing that's important to note is just because cases are low does not mean that you can relax your behavior, your interventions too much. Because if you relax them too much, you then have the exponential growth rate. And as I show here, it only takes a matter of a few weeks or a couple months to get completely out of control, or mostly out of control. So the situation for it to become dire from a public health and healthcare management perspective. So I've made this table available at this link. I've provided the link in the description, as well as in my references earlier, so that you can work around these probabilities and kind of play with the numbers a little bit and get a sense of the pattern if you feel so inclined. I invite you to do it if you're not familiar with these kind of models, just to be, you know, to get a more intuitive sense about, you know, how sensitive your risk is to behavior, and how sensitive the and so those spreadsheets also update these models based on behavior and on that. So you can see how, you know, behavioral changes and how that would impact the forecasting for the rest of society and how many people will get sick and eventually are expected to die from the disease. So we actually do have an impact that we can make by taking precautions. And I want to talk about those precautions now. Impacts on public health policy. So understanding this framework, how do the things that we have policies for and behavioral shifts for, like reducing socializing, quarantining, things like wearing masks, all these things, testing, how they can reduce R0 and impact the public health and the total number of people that will survive a pandemic, and how much stress it'll put on the society. I was going to do this as a separate video, and I will. So that's where I'm going to call it for now. And I want to talk in the next video about specifically about how each of these policies can impact what we see in terms of risk and how the cases will play out in the society in a particular region. So I talked about Suffolk, but it could be any arbitrary region. So I hope this was useful or insightful, and I invite feedback and comments. So be well.